Welcome, everyone, to this conversation that Pastors Amy and Jon and I are really excited to have. More conversation about what has occurred in Israel and Palestine, that part of the world that we who are Christians and others tend to call the Holy Land, although, gosh, so many unholy events happen there. It's hard to kind of work with that as a kind of a nickname for the place, but it's important for us as Christian leaders to have good conversations about that. And Pastor Amy and Pastor Jon and I have kind of kept conversing since the forum that Pastor Amy led on this last Sunday, in October, and we just thought we would kind of continue the conversation this way.
Yeah, and these are principles even that we're using at the council level as a way to have better conversations.
Mm-hmm. Yep. And so we want to model better conversations amongst ourselves, and so we'll try not to yell at each other.
We try.
We'll try. But seriously, we're going to take winning off the table. That's number one. We want to reach deeper understanding. That's kind of, instead of winning, deeper understanding. We're going to prioritize our relationships and listen passionately to one another. So I tend to speak passionately. It's a bigger work for me to listen passionately, so that I love this as a way that we have conversations here at St. John's. We're going to pay attention to context. I really appreciated that about the Sunday forum, Pastor Amy, that a lot of what you were sharing was helping me gain an idea of context into this conversation.
That's going to be particularly important for this conversation.
Yeah, and fourth one is to embrace vulnerability. Again, this is... to have real conversation, we have to kind of have humility, which is one of our values.
I was say it's one of our values.
Yeah. So we want to model that, and then make room for transformation. And so, not that it happens every time, but we want to make space that what I'm thinking now might be different from what I end up thinking. In fact, I hope that's true.
I think your mind can be changed, but you also don't have to change your mind to be transformed. You can gain greater understanding, more empathy, and to have these kind of conversations in our current context and culture are going to become more and more important. And it's understanding things in a greater kind of subtlety, and there's a lot of subtlety when it comes to this conversation about what's happening in the war over there right now.
Yeah, and I'll just say, and the one thing that was very important for me, and which really, when it wasn't me who came up with this idea, is, hey, let's start with a pastor conversation. We have 3 pastors at St. John's. Is that there are many, many voices, and I have a lot of ways in which I tend to be like about 4 or 5 different people, even as I'm processing this.
Yeah.
And so we're not going to hear all the voices in one forum. And a conversation is never supposed to be just covered in 1 hour. So we want to make sure that we're doing that. And
I think one of the things we realized as we were trying to think, what is our response, is that, we don't all agree, or we're not all exactly in the same spot, right? And so I think having this conversation is actually modeling these 5 things. And I think even the transformation is not only like leaving it open as a personal transformation, but, transforming a relationship together. How do we have relationships with people on both sides of this issue, or, whether it's our Jewish siblings, Muslim, Palestinian siblings, how do we even make room for transformation in those relationships?
Yeah.
By our wanting to know more,
Yeah.
by our listening, by our humility, or, and trying to share honestly where we are, but also listen to where other people are at too.
Yeah. I wish folks could have been in the room, just a couple hours ago when we had an hour conversation already and realized this is something we could record, because I think there was some real use of these, including the listening. And one of the things I think I did hear that we are holding in common is an inability to have our Christian faith ever say it's okay for violence, for destruction of human life, to tolerate human suffering and not react to that as we think Jesus would. And that's at least a common ground that I think we hold, which makes any war or any kind of violence towards other humans intolerable, and even the concept of just war problematic.
Yeah, I really feel like what you just said, Jon, it should make this a very easy call for Christians as we address violence in all forms, but to say that the terrorist act of Hamas was heinous, it is unsupportable as acts that Christians should find themselves in any way being able to support, and that violence had very specific consequences to people we care about. Israelis, Jewish people, and it has had, as in the conversations I've had, really deep impacts with my Jewish friends here in America who are processing what this terrorist act has meant in their lives. Many of whom, by the way, have been critical of Israel as a government, but who found in the moment of responding to this really experiencing deep suffering and a bit of silence from people who they thought would move towards them to express our sorrowing with them. So I just wanted to say that an important thing in this whole conversation is for me to move towards my American Jewish friends, because I tend to have more American Jewish friends than Muslim friends, and I'm going to have to address that in my own experience in life. I think that's just because of kind of the world I worked in, and
well, I think as Christians too. I mean, it's been a work of the Lutheran Church to build those interfaith relationships, also with Muslims, but definitely with Jewish siblings because of our history of anti-Semitism and Luther's own writings, and so we've made a real effort there, and also that whole thing where we come out of Judaism in our tradition, right, and then Islam comes out of both, and so it's kind of like we look up to Judaism, but we can sort of ignore Islam in a way, right, sometimes as Christians, and again, that isn't the LCA position or our position, but it just kind of is a reality that it's sometimes easier for us to have sympathy and those relationships on the side of Judaism and Jewish friends than to have connections with Muslims. Although, in my first call, I was in the Muslim community, and so that actually was a unique. Dearborn Heights is not the Muslim community, but there's a large number of Muslims, Christian, Arabs too, and so I've had probably more interfaith experience with Muslims than many of our colleagues do, and so it isn't something we normally have as Christians in this country.
Here's one of the things that I think is particularly tricky is that I think because of our Lutheran context, which has roots certainly connected to Germany and very real anti-Semitism right out of the mouth of Martin Luther himself, and our church has offered formal apologies to Jews. So we have, built those kind of relationships. My fear is that out of our fear of appearing anti-Semitic, that we would be silent to a violent counter-reaction by Israel, which we're seeing. I mean, and this is what happens. You get attacked and you naturally want to attack back, and states see that as necessary sometimes to show force. But it perpetuates itself, and my Christian values, that makes me have to think about this differently. To both honor the suffering of brothers and sisters, and I have, family members who are Jewish, and at the same time not be permissive to extending violence.
And for me, Jon, I agree I think, especially as Christian leaders, listening closely to Jesus, anti-violent response to violence seems to be kind of a key part of the gospel message, and one we're not always great at incorporating into day-to-day life or into our life as nation states. Because we live in a representative democracy, we're responsible for American response always to violence,
Right.
and so I think that's a real important distinction. I personally really believe that we can call this violence against the Jewish people that were living just outside of Gaza, who were attacked in this terrorist act, as something that is, like, awful and heinous. And I can even say that I believe that Israel has a right to respond, but I would never say that as a Christian leader I would just give blanket sanction to any response to violence, including this one, which is pretty deeply felt by people I respect and love who are Jewish and feel this very deeply.
Yeah.
So, but I do think there is the ability to acknowledge within history specific moments that have deep impact and should be recognized. And I see this attack, this terrorist assault in Israel, as something that we need to make sure that we move up alongside our Jewish and brothers and sisters, and especially those we know, and say, this was not right, and we stand with you as you feel this very deep suffering. It doesn't mean there wasn't suffering that preceded it, or obviously there's suffering that's happened already since this happened in Gaza. But we can be specific too, and that's how I want to make sure that voice is lifted up and is heard in this conversation.
Yeah, and that's important. I have a lot of experience and relationships with Palestinians as well, and being actually in the Palestinian territories to see how on a daily basis occupation and oppression happens at the hands of the state in the West Bank. I've never been to Gaza. But, I think we also need to hear the pain of Palestinians that have not felt for decades, like we've been hearing their suffering. And, disproportionate, even in this case, disproportionate loss of life, being 5 times more. And that's, again, not to excuse or say that it condone any of the loss of life. I was just on a call with, or a Zoom conversation with Bishop Yunan, who was for a long time the bishop of the Evangelical Lutheran Church in Jordan and the Holy Land. And he said all the things that we've just said about, Christians having a different way, and that Jesus is on the side of the marginalized, which can be Jews at the hands of anti-Semitism, as well as Palestinians oppressed by the Israeli occupation. But he said, over the last 20 years, the United States and the West have done nothing to advance, nothing real except lip service, to advance justice and a real solution. The one silver lining, if there is any, is that I think now the world sees that you cannot ignore this issue. It is a number one issue, and it's spilling over. It's spilling over into the American Jewish community as well as the American Muslim community. Yeah. A Palestinian Muslim boy was killed 2 days after the attack by someone who was whipped up by by what they were watching on different news outlets and stuff, and so it's spilling over throughout the world because we call it the Holy Land because everyone's eyes are on it, or there's all these layers of where our faith is connected there. And if we don't, as Christians, do something to advance justice and peace, I mean, there's never going to be an end to this, and the possibility for a peaceful and just solution will be more and more less possible. Less and less possible.
I think from you, Amy, I've learned. You said layers. In my experience of traveling to the Holy Land with you and others from our community this past earlier this year. I learned not only about the archaeological layers there, but the layers of subtlety. And even in the conversation earlier this afternoon, you again remind me of the distinction that we have the state of Israel, the nation of Israel, which is different and separate from a faith tradition of Jews and Judaism, right? And even within Judaism, you have a wide range of perspectives, from very orthodox to very progressive. And I think what we tend to do in popular understanding is sometimes equate Israel with Judaism. And they are not the same thing. There are Christian Israelis. There are Christian Palestinians. There are Jewish Israelis. There are Jewish Palestinians. You know, the mix and the subtlety of that, I think, sometimes has withheld our nation and our people from getting involved because we feel so much like we'll make mistakes. And even us in these conversations where we probably are going to say something that's going to be a mistake. Like we've talked about that. But it still is important enough to enter into these conversations and try to understand more. And I do think probably the Palestinian stories are, at least for me, they personally were much more misunderstood or not known going into that experience of traveling to the Holy Land. So we talked about really wanting to be equitable and balanced in our approach to this, because there is really suffering and all sides of this. And therefore what you're saying, Amy, peace also has to involve all the sides coming to the table, where it will just perpetuate itself.
I think as long I think I can agree with that, as long as, I guess where I might differ is equitable cannot mean we do not see or hear specifics that occur.
Yeah.
I mean, that terrorist attack, if we kind of take off the sharp edge of that through us kind of talking about equity, we're going to take off the sharp edge if there are war crimes that happen against Gazans. It would be equally, if that does happen as a result of this, some would argue it already has, but to take the sharp edges off that would be not paying attention and listening. So equitable to me does not mean diminishing a full hearing and a full viewing of what is.
Of specifics. I really like that.
Specifics are important to me. And I told you this, I'm a twin. I'm a twin. And to the whole world, my brother and I are exactly the same. But inside me, I've never been my brother. And so when people treat me like I'm the same as my brother, I was always like, well, that's ridiculous. And it is. But so specifics matter, and I want us to not, and specifics do not end with this Hamas terrorist attack on innocent civilians and hostages taken. That is all true, and we have to be there. But specifics will have happened before. Specifics will continue to happen. We want to live with all of them, and not rub them down and make them like palatable for us somehow.
Yeah.
So, are there any last? As we're left wondering, aren't we? A lot as we talk together. We're fortunate to have trusted colleagues we can have these conversations with, but I this is not intended to be the final word in this. We're going to keep trying to have voices lifted up, and with war will come more opportunities for Christians to speak into it. That's always the case. We should listen closely to a call to nonviolence. Pastor Jerry Pedersen was the one who really taught me about that as true Christian calling, was nonviolence as our way to have effective approaches to violence that don't just perpetuate it. So
true. I think I don't know if I have a final thought, just that the conversation needs to continue.
Yeah, I just hope that people hear, like when people have been calling for ceasefire or humanitarian aid, I've seen where people then think that you aren't hearing the Jewish pain. And so that's where it gets hard, because it's like, if we are calling for nonviolence, then there does need to be critique of the response that has happened, because it has been disproportionate. But it hasn't sounded that way to me in the media, where they're sort of just letting Israel respond in the way that they want to respond. And that if you critique that, then that is like not hearing the pain of others. So that's where I get caught. I'm really struggling, honestly.
Yeah.
Because, I just know so much of what happens on a daily basis prior to this for Palestinians, and no one often hears. And some of it, I wouldn't make it equivalent to what Hamas did, because it's horrendous, and the torturing and but there are ways that, Palestinian children are arrested and taken by Israeli soldiers for very minor, what we would consider, I think, minor things like throwing a stone or something, and so there's disproportionate or unequal treatment already in the occupied territories. And so it gets hard to say, okay, like, how do we, like, can we just call for ceasefire? Is that is that an okay
when you
thing?
You witness that, you've witnessed actually this yourself.
Well,
and
I think there are Jewish voices that I hear, American Jewish voices at least, that are wondering about what the response should be.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't think,
protesting also for ceasefire.
So I think there's a multiplicity of voices but by all our people of faith that are, it's not just Christians that have this kind of deep strain of nonviolence we have to tend to. This is in other traditions too. We don't have the market on it.
Right.
It would be foolish to assume that a ceasefire followed by returning things to the way they were prior to this terrorist attack by Hamas is going to be a lasting peace. What the conversation has to go further on how Israel as a nation will be in and with people who are, not a part of the nation of Israel, but in some families are brothers and sisters living across the side of a wall, and how they're going to be together in community in ways that are less oppressive and less unequal in power.
I guess
that might, ceasefire now, and then a lot of work to come.
What follows?
And I'll just say, kind of as my last thought here, is that, Luther talked about this, that God's involved in all of the world, not just in the religious institution of the church, but in all things. Yeah. And so as Americans, we need to be involved, people need to struggle with involvement. And I'm really not called to be an American kind of political leader, but I am called to be a religious leader of the church. And so I will be, if I have a commitment, it will be to some of these principles of how Christians model a different way in the world, not exclusively other traditions. There's overlap here, but my work is to really watch how Jesus operated in the midst of conflict, violence, and promote that, even as I come up alongside suffering people of all kinds. And we'll try to lift up those voices of suffering, not just one, but when we see it, that's a part of our calling for another way. So anyway, I appreciate this conversation with both of you. It's really nice to have colleagues that we can have these sorts of discussions together. And I like that we're trying to have better conversations and
model it.
Yeah. And we welcome people entering this conversation, be in communication with us. And
thanks for listening.
Yeah, thank you.